The sound of metal grinding against asphalt, a child's scream cut short, the sickening thud of flesh meeting concrete. In that split second between safety and catastrophe, between the life you've built and the life that built you, everything changes. One moment you're invisible, just another ghost hiding in plain sight, content to let the world forget you ever existed. The next, you're thrown back into the light, exposed and vulnerable, with nowhere left to run. They say the past always catches up. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it arrives wearing a $3,000 suit, carrying legal papers, and armed with the kind of truth that can destroy everything you fought to protect. Some men spend their lives running from their mistakes, others run from their innocence. But when the storm finally breaks, when the lies unravel and the hunters become the hunted, you discover that redemption isn't something you find. It's something you fight for. This is the story of that fight. The story of what happens when a man with nothing left to lose meets a woman with everything to protect. And together they discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust again. The October sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Millbrook, Ohio, painting the small town in hues of amber and gold. Marcus Mack Sullivan wiped the grease from his weathered hands with a rag that had seen better days, the fabric as worn and tired as the man who held it. At 52, Mack carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to find peace in solitude, though the lines etched around his eyes spoke of burdens that went far deeper than age. Sullivan's auto repair sat at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, its paint peeling and sign faded from years of neglect. Inside, the garage hummed with the quiet efficiency of a man who had found his rhythm in the mundane. Mack had been fixing cars for 15 years now. Ever since his previous life had ended in a blaze of headlines and accusations that still haunted his dreams. The bell above his door chimed softly as the afternoon breeze stirred through the open bay doors. Mack paused in his work on a 2003 Honda Civic, its engine spread across his workbench like the mechanical equivalent of a jigsaw puzzle. Something about the methodical nature of repair work soothed him, taking something broken and making it whole again, piece by piece. A child's laughter drifted from across the street, and Mack glanced up to see a boy of about 8 chasing a bright red soccer ball down the sidewalk. The kid had that carefree abandon that only children possessed, his sneakers slapping against the pavement as he pursued his prize with single-minded determination. Mack smiled despite himself. There was something pure about that kind of joy, untainted by the complexities and disappointments that seemed to accumulate with age. He was about to return to his work when the ball took an unfortunate bounce, rolling directly into the path of oncoming traffic on Route 9. Time seemed to slow as Mack watched the boy, Danny, he would later learn, dart into the street without a second thought. A massive delivery truck, its driver likely distracted or simply unable to stop in time, bore down on the child with terrifying inevitability. Mack didn't think. 15 years of self-imposed isolation, of careful distance from the world and its inhabitants, evaporated in an instant. His body moved before his mind could catch up, propelled by an instinct he thought he'd buried along with his old life. He hit the boy in a full-body tackle just as the truck's horn blared its warning. The world exploded into a chaos of screeching brakes, grinding metal, and the sharp crack of Mack's shoulder hitting the asphalt. Pain shot through his body like lightning, but his arms remained locked around the small form beneath him, shielding the child from the impact. The truck roared past, missing them by inches that felt like miles. For a moment, the street was eerily quiet except for the distant rumble of the truck disappearing around the bend. Mack lay on the unforgiving pavement, his shoulder screaming in protest, but alive. More importantly, the boy beneath him was alive too. "Hey there, buddy," Mack wheezed, carefully rolling to the side. "You okay?" Danny's eyes were wide with shock, but he nodded mutely, a few scrapes on his palms and knees, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and a mother's kisses. "My ball," Danny whispered, his voice trembling. Mack chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. "Trust me, kid, Balls are a lot easier to replace than 8-year-old boys. The sound of rapid footsteps and a car door slamming announced the arrival of someone Mac assumed was the boy's mother. He looked up to see a woman in her late 40s rushing toward them, her face a mask of terror and relief fighting for dominance. She was striking in a way that spoke of natural beauty rather than artifice. Shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the afternoon light, intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her clothes were simple but well-made dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and boots that suggested she was no stranger to practical concerns. "Danny!" She dropped to her knees beside them, her hands immediately checking her son for injuries with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had dealt with her share of childhood mishaps. "Oh God, Danny, are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Mom," Danny said, though his voice still carried a tremor. "This man saved me." Only then did the woman, Tori, though Mac wouldn't learn her name for several more minutes, turn her full attention to him. Mac was struggling to sit up, his shoulder clearly damaged, but his concern focused entirely on the boy. "Sir, are you all right?" Her voice carried an educated accent, cultured but not pretentious. There was genuine concern in her eyes as she took in his obvious pain. "You're hurt," Mac waved off her worry with his good arm. "Nothing that won't heal. Your boy's fine. That's what matters." "Nothing that won't heal?" Tori's eyebrows rose. "You're clearly in pain. We need to get you to a hospital." "No hospitals," Mac said quickly, perhaps too quickly. He saw something flicker in her expression. Not suspicion, exactly, but a sharpening of attention. "I'm fine, really, just bruised." Tori helped Danny to his feet, but her gaze remained fixed on Mac. "You saved my son's life. There has to be something we can do to thank you." Mac managed to stand, favoring his injured shoulder. "No thanks necessary. Just keep an eye on him near the road. Kids don't always see danger coming." Danny tugged at his mother's sweater. "Mom, is he a superhero?" Despite his pain, Mac laughed, a sound that felt foreign even to his own ears. "Not quite up, buddy. Just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "I'm Victoria," the woman said, extending her hand. "Victoria Ashford. And this is Danny." "Max Sullivan," he replied, shaking her hand with his uninjured arm. Her grip was firm, confident. "And I really should get back to work." Victoria's eyes darted to the garage behind him, taking in the modest operation with what seemed like genuine interest rather than judgment. "You're a mechanic, among other things." Mac was already backing toward his sanctuary, eager to escape the unexpected human contact. People asking questions made him nervous, even innocent ones. "Take care of yourself, Danny, and listen to your mom about street safety." As he retreated to his garage, Mac could feel Victoria's eyes on him. There was something about her attention that felt different from the casual curiosity of most people. More focused, more analytical, like she was filing away information for later use. But Mac had learned not to dwell on such things. People came and went from his life like passing storms. He fixed their cars, took their money, and maintained the careful distance that had kept him safe for 15 years. What he couldn't know, as he disappeared into the familiar shadows of his garage, was that this particular storm was about to reshape his entire world. Victoria Ashford stood in the parking lot of Millbrook's only coffee shop, her hands wrapped around a paper cup that had long since gone cold. Through the window, she watched Danny color at one of the small tables inside, his tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on what appeared to be a drawing of the afternoon's events. 3 days had passed since the accident, and Victoria couldn't stop thinking about Max Sullivan, not just because he'd saved Danny's life, though that alone would have been enough to earn her eternal gratitude, but because something about him didn't quite add up. She'd built a $20 billion tech empire by reading people, by seeing the patterns others missed, and Max Sullivan was definitely hiding something. The way he'd refused medical attention despite obvious injury, his nervous retreat when she'd tried to thank him, the fleeting expression of panic when she'd mentioned hospitals. Most telling of all was the garage itself. What she'd glimpsed in those few moments suggested capabilities far beyond basic automotive repair. Victoria pulled out her phone and scrolled through the discreet background check she'd commissioned. On paper, Max Sullivan was exactly what he appeared to be, a small-town mechanic who'd lived quietly in Millbrook for 15 years. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no family to speak of. He paid his taxes, kept to himself, and had earned a reputation for honest work at fair prices. But the report also contained a curious gap. Before appearing in Millbrook, Marcus Sullivan simply hadn't existed. For most people, that might have been the end of their curiosity, but Victoria hadn't become one of the world's wealthiest women by accepting surface explanations. Besides, she owed this man a debt that went beyond money. Danny was everything to her, her anchor, her purpose, her reason for the elaborate charade that had brought them to this small Ohio town. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed as Danny burst outside, his latest artistic creation clutched in his small hands. "Mom, look." He held up the drawing, a remarkably detailed sketch for an 8-year-old, showing a man with kind eyes pulling a boy away from a large truck. "I made this for Mr. Mac." Victoria studied the picture, noting the care Danny had taken with the details. In the 3 days since the accident, her son had talked about little else but the cool mechanic who'd saved him. It was the most animated she'd seen Danny since they'd arrived in Millbrook 6 months ago. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, crouching down to his level. "I'm sure he'll love it." "Can we go see him?" "Please," Victoria hesitated. Part of her wanted to maintain the careful distance she'd cultivated since arriving in town. Getting too close to people meant risking exposure, and exposure meant Richard finding them. But the hope in Danny's eyes made the decision for her. "All right," she said, "but just for a few minutes." The walk to Sullivan's Auto Repair took them past the heart of Millbrook's modest downtown. Victoria loved this about small-town life, the way you could walk everywhere, the way shopkeepers waved from their doorways, the sense of community that had been so absent from their previous life. Of course, maintaining her cover story required constant vigilance. To everyone in Millbrook, she was Tori Ashford, recently divorced administrative assistant who'd moved to town for a fresh start. Her story was carefully crafted and consistently maintained modest savings, basic skills, looking for simple work to support herself and her son. The truth was infinitely more complicated. Victoria Ashford was the founder and CEO of Ashtec Corporation, a company that had revolutionized quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Her algorithms powered everything from financial markets to space exploration. Forbes had featured her on 3 covers, and her net worth fluctuated somewhere north of $20 billion depending on market conditions. She was also a mother desperately trying to protect her son from a father who viewed children as assets to be controlled rather than loved. The garage came into view, its humble exterior a stark contrast to the high-tech laboratories and boardrooms that had defined Victoria's life for the past 2 decades. Mac was visible through the open bay doors, bent over the engine of an old pickup truck with an intensity that spoke of genuine engagement with his work. "Mr. Mac," Danny called out. "Running ahead." Mac looked up, and Victoria caught the brief flash of pleasure that crossed his features before his habitual wariness reasserted itself. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out to meet them. "Hey there. Danny, how are you feeling?" "Great, look what I made for you." Danny thrust the drawing toward Mac with the unrestrained enthusiasm only children could manage. Mac accepted the picture with obvious care, studying it with the seriousness it deserved. "This is incredible, buddy. You've got real talent." Victoria watched the interaction with growing interest. There was something in Mac's manner with Danny, a natural ease that suggested experience with children, despite his apparent solitary lifestyle. When he looked at her son, the guardedness that seemed to define him melted away, replaced by genuine warmth. "I hope we're not interrupting," Victoria said, stepping forward. "Danny's been asking about you constantly since Tuesday." "Not at all," Mac replied, though she caught the slight stiffening in his posture. "Always happy to see Danny." The boy was already exploring the garage with wide-eyed fascination, drawn to the array of tools and machinery like a moth to flame. Victoria found herself following his lead, taking in details she'd missed during their brief encounter 3 days earlier. The garage was meticulously organized despite its cluttered appearance. Tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboards. Parts were sorted and labeled with an almost scientific attention to detail. But what caught Victoria's trained eye were the subtle indicators of capabilities that went far beyond automotive repair. A computer workstation in the corner featured hardware that was definitely not standard for a small-town garage. Multiple monitors, high-end processors, and what looked like custom modifications that suggested someone with serious technical expertise. Scattered among the automotive manuals were texts on advanced mathematics, quantum mechanics, and aerospace engineering. "Quite a setup you have here," Victoria commented, her tone carefully casual. Mac followed her gaze and seemed to realize what she was seeing. "I like to stay current," he said, the defensive note in his voice confirming her suspicions. "Modern cars are basically computers with wheels." It was a reasonable explanation, but Victoria's instincts told her there was more to it. Much more. "Danny seems taken with you," she said, watching her son examine a complex-looking diagnostic machine with fascination. "He doesn't warm up to people easily." "He's a good kid," Mac replied. "Smart, too. Asked me yesterday how internal combustion engines work. Most adults can't even change their oil." Victoria smiled. "He's always been curious about how things work. Takes after his—" She paused, catching herself before mentioning Danny's grandfather, a brilliant engineer who'd been one of her greatest inspirations before his death 5 years earlier. "Takes after me, I suppose," Mac nodded, but she caught the way his eyes sharpened slightly at her near slip. This man was definitely more observant than he let on. "What about you?" Mac asked. "Danny mentioned you work with computers." Another carefully prepared piece of her cover story. "Administrative work, mostly, data entry, basic office management. Nothing too exciting." It was technically true. Running a tech company did involve a lot of administrative oversight, but Victoria could see that Mac wasn't entirely buying her modest self-description. There was intelligence in his eyes, a sharp awareness that suggested he was as skilled at reading people as she was. "Mom," Danny called from across the garage, "can Mr. Mac show me how to fix cars?" Victoria looked at Mac, noting the conflicted expression that crossed his features. He clearly enjoyed Danny's company, but something was holding him back from deeper engagement. "I'm sure Mr. Mac is very busy," Victoria said diplomatically. "We should probably—" "Actually," Mac interrupted, surprising them both. "If it's okay with your mom, I could show you a few basic things. Nothing dangerous, just how to check oil. Maybe look at how a simple engine works." Danny's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really, can I?" "Mom," Victoria found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. "If Mr. Mac doesn't mind." "Not at all," Mac said, and for the first time since they'd met, his smile seemed completely genuine. "But we'll start simple. Tool safety first, then we'll see what's under the hood of that old Honda over there." As Victoria watched Mac patiently explain the function of various tools to her son, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of peace. Danny was laughing, engaged in a way he hadn't been since they'd left their old life behind. And Mac, despite his obvious reservations about human connection, was clearly enjoying himself. But Victoria's peace was tempered by concern. The more time they spent with Mac Sullivan, the more questions she had about who he really was. And in her experience, people who had secrets were either hiding from something dangerous or hiding something dangerous themselves. For Danny's sake, she needed to find out which category Max Sullivan fell into. What she couldn't know was that across town, a private investigator hired by her ex-husband was uploading photographs of their visit to Sullivan's auto repair, along with a detailed report on the mysterious mechanic who had caught the attention of Richard Ashford's missing wife and son. The hunt was about to begin. The call came at 2:47 a.m., jarring Victoria from the deepest sleep she'd managed in months. Her secure phone, one of three devices she maintained for different aspects of her carefully compartmentalized life, buzzed with the specific ringtone that meant urgent business. "Ms. Ashford," came the crisp voice of her head of security, James Chen. "We have a situation." Victoria was instantly alert, slipping out of bed and padding to her home office, where she could speak without waking Danny. The small rented house in Millbrook was a far cry from her penthouse in Manhattan, but it served their purposes perfectly. "What kind of situation?" she asked, settling behind the desk that held her hidden array of encrypted communications equipment. "Richard's made his move. He's hired Blackstone Investigations. They're the best private detective agency money can buy. They've been asking questions about you in Millbrook." Victoria's blood ran cold. Blackstone had a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and utterly ruthless in pursuing their targets. If Richard had brought them into the game, it meant he was serious about finding her and Danny. "How much do they know?" "They've confirmed your location and have been conducting surveillance for the past week. But here's where it gets interesting. They're not just investigating you. They're digging deep into Marcus Sullivan." Victoria's grip tightened on the phone. "The mechanic, why?" "Apparently, their surveillance photos show you and Danny spending significant time at his garage. Richards instructed them to investigate anyone in your orbit, but they've hit something unusual with Sullivan." "What do you mean, unusual?" James's voice carried a note of intrigue. "Marcus Sullivan's background check revealed some interesting anomalies. On the surface, he's exactly what he appears to be. A small-town mechanic who's lived quietly in Millbrook for 15 years. But dig deeper, and the picture gets murky." Victoria was already powering up her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed her own investigative resources. "I ran a basic background check myself. Clean record, steady employment history, no red flags." "That's just it," James continued. "It's too clean. Marcus Sullivan appeared in Millbrook 15 years ago with a perfectly crafted identity, complete with social security records, employment history, and references. But before that, nothing. It's as if he didn't exist." Victoria's screens filled with data as her own investigators fed information to her in real time. "Professional witness protection?" That was my first thought, but I've checked with my contacts in the Marshal Service. No record of anyone matching his description in WITSEC. This is something else entirely. Victoria studied the information flowing across her screens. Financial records showing modest but consistent income. Property records for the garage building, purchased 15 years ago with cash, vehicle registrations, tax returns, utility bills, all perfectly normal and perfectly documented, and all of it starting exactly 15 years ago, as if Marcus Sullivan had materialized from thin air. "There's more," James said. "I had our tech team run facial recognition against government databases. They found something interesting, a 73% match with NASA personnel records from 2008. Victoria's breath caught. NASA. Dr. Marcus Sullivan, former aerospace engineer, specialist in propulsion systems. He was part of the team that designed the Artemis third mission propulsion systems. Brilliant reputation, fast-track career, considered one of the rising stars in the space program. What happened to him?" The pause on the other end of the line told Victoria she wasn't going to like the answer. 2009. The Artemis 3 mission ended in disaster. Propulsion system failure resulted in the loss of 3 astronauts. Dr. Marcus Sullivan was the lead engineer on the team that designed the failed systems. The official investigation concluded that design flaws in his propulsion calculations were responsible for the tragedy. Victoria felt the pieces clicking into place. He was scapegoated. That's what it looks like. Sullivan maintained his innocence, claimed there were cost-cutting measures that compromised the safety systems he designed. But NASA needed someone to blame, and he was the most convenient target. Career destroyed, reputation ruined, facing potential criminal charges for negligent homicide. And then he disappeared. Vanished completely in late 2009. No forwarding address, no contact with former colleagues, no digital footprint, until Marcus Sullivan, small-town mechanic, appeared in Millbrook, Ohio, in early 2010. Victoria leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. The man who had saved her son's life, who was patiently teaching Danny about engines and tools, was a former NASA engineer carrying the weight of 3 deaths on his conscience. James, I need you to dig deeper into that NASA investigation. If Mac was innocent, already on it, I've got our best people pulling files, looking for inconsistencies in the official report. But Victoria, you need to know, Richard's investigators are closing in on the same information. They're specifically looking for anything they can use to paint Sullivan as dangerous or unstable. The implication was clear. If Richard could prove that Victoria was associating with someone who had been involved in the deaths of 3 people, it would be devastating in any custody hearing. How long do we have? Maybe 48 hours before Blackstone connects the dots. They're good, but they're working from the outside. We have better resources. Victoria made her decision. I need to talk to Mac. He deserves to know what's coming. Victoria, I strongly advise against that. Your cover story depends on maintaining the fiction that you're a simple administrative assistant. If you reveal that you have access to this kind of information, my cover story is already compromised if Richard's found us. Victoria interrupted. And if Max Sullivan is innocent of those deaths, he's going to need allies with resources, real resources. After ending the call, Victoria sat in the darkness of her small office, weighing her options. Danny was finally happy for the first time since they left their old life. He was thriving under Mac's patient mentorship, showing an interest in learning and creating that had been dormant for months. But if Mac really was responsible for those deaths, Victoria pulled up the official NASA report on the Artemis III disaster. 3 astronauts, Commander Sarah Chen, mission specialist David Rodriguez, and pilot Jennifer Walsh, had died when their spacecraft's propulsion system had catastrophically failed during a routine orbital maneuver. The investigation had been thorough, the conclusions damning. Dr. Marcus Sullivan's design calculations had been flawed. His propulsion system specifications had failed to account for the extreme stress conditions the spacecraft would encounter. When subjected to those stresses, critical components had failed, resulting in an explosion that killed all 3 crew members instantly. The report painted Sullivan as either criminally negligent or woefully incompetent. His protests about cost-cutting measures and safety compromises had been dismissed as the desperate attempts of a man trying to avoid responsibility for his failures. But Victoria had spent 20 years reading technical reports, analyzing data, and making decisions based on incomplete information. Something about the official narrative felt wrong. The mathematics in Sullivan's original design proposals were elegant, sophisticated, and from what she could see, entirely sound. The man who had written those calculations was not someone who would make basic computational errors, which meant either he had suffered some kind of breakdown that had compromised his abilities, or the failures had occurred for reasons beyond his control. Victoria's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from her head of security. Preliminary review of NASA files suggests possible cover-up, multiple inconsistencies in testimony from supervisory personnel. Recommend full investigation. That settled it. Victoria owed Max Sullivan the truth about what was coming, and if he was innocent, if he had been carrying the burden of 3 deaths that weren't his fault for 15 years, then she had the resources to help prove it. The question was whether revealing those resources would destroy the sanctuary she'd built for Danny in this small Ohio town. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Victoria made her choice. She would tell Max Sullivan who she really was, warn him about Richard's investigation, and offer him something he probably thought he'd lost forever, the chance at vindication. She just hoped she wasn't about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Victoria found Mac exactly where she expected. Elbow deep in the engine of a 1995 Chevy Silverado, his movements precise and methodical despite the early hour. It was barely 7 a.m., but Sullivan's auto repair was already humming with quiet activity. Danny was still asleep at home, watched over by Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had become Victoria's go-to babysitter during her months in Millbrook. This conversation needed to happen without young ears nearby. "Working early today," Victoria observed, stepping into the garage. Mac looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "Tori, everything okay? You look like I haven't slept." Victoria managed a tired smile. "That's because I haven't. We need to talk, Mac, about who you really are." The wrench in Mac's hand clattered to the concrete floor. For a moment, his face went completely blank. Not the careful neutrality she'd grown accustomed to, but the absolute stillness of someone who had just heard their world crumbling. "I don't know what you mean," he said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. Victoria pulled her phone from her pocket and held up a photograph. Dr. Marcus Sullivan in a NASA lab coat, standing beside a scale model of the Artemis III spacecraft. The image was 15 years old, but the resemblance was unmistakable despite the passage of time and the weight of accumulated guilt. Max stared at the photograph for a long moment, then slowly straightened, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for a blow. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since about 3 this morning," Victoria replied honestly. "The question is, how long have you been carrying the weight of something that wasn't your fault?" Mac's laugh was bitter, hollow. 15 years, and you don't know what you're talking about if you think it wasn't my fault. 3 people died because of my calculations, my design, my failures." "No," Victoria said firmly. 3 people died because NASA cut corners on materials and safety protocols, then hung you out to dry to protect their budget allocations." Mac went very still. "What did you just say?" Victoria took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, the point where she would either gain Mac's trust or lose it forever. "My name isn't Tori Ashford, small-town administrative assistant," she began. "It's Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashtec Corporation. I'm worth about $20 billion, and I have investigative resources that most governments would envy." Max stared at her as if she had suddenly sprouted a second head. "You're hiding in a small Ohio town from my ex-husband, who wants to take my son away from me and use him as a pawn in his own power games." Victoria continued, "Just like you're hiding from a past that destroyed your life because you were convenient scapegoat for institutional failures." "Ashtec," Mac repeated slowly. "The quantum computing company, the AI systems that are revolutionizing everything." "Yes." Victoria sat down on a nearby stool, suddenly feeling the weight of her sleepless night. "I built that company from nothing. Mac, I understand brilliant engineering when I see it, and I understand institutional politics that sacrifice individuals to protect larger interests." Mac rubbed his face with hands that weren't quite steady. "So what are you saying that you've investigated me, that you know about?" "I know that your original design specifications for the Artemis III propulsion system were flawless," Victoria said quietly. "I know that NASA made 17 separate modifications to your design, each one cutting costs and compromising safety margins. I know that you objected to 12 of those modifications in writing, and that your objections were overruled by supervisory personnel who were under pressure to meet budget targets." Mac's eyes widened. "How could you possibly know that those files are classified?" Victoria's smile was grim. "When you have $20 billion and the best hackers in the world on your payroll, very few files stay classified for long. The truth is all there, Mac, buried under layers of bureaucratic cover-up. But it's there." Mac sank onto a nearby chair, looking suddenly older than his 52 years. "Even if that's true, and I'm not saying I believe it is, what difference does it make now? Chen, Rodriguez, Walsh, they're still dead. Their families still blame me. NASA still considers me a pariah. It makes a difference because the truth matters," Victoria said fiercely. "It makes a difference because you've been carrying guilt that isn't yours for 15 years. And it makes a difference because my ex-husband has hired investigators to dig into your past, and they're going to use the official version of events to paint you as dangerous." That got Mac's attention. Your ex-husband. Why would he care about me? Victoria explained about Richard, about the custody battle, about the elaborate charade that had brought her to Millbrook. Mac listened with growing incredulity, occasionally shaking his head as if trying to process the sheer scope of the deception. So let me get this straight, he said when she finished. You're a billionaire CEO pretending to be a single mom administrative assistant, hiding from your ex-husband who wants to steal your kid. And now you're telling me that I've been wrongly blamed for killing 3 astronauts. That's a somewhat reductive summary, but essentially accurate. Max stood up, pacing to the far end of the garage and back. This is insane. My life was crazy enough before I knew any of this. I know how it sounds, Victoria said. But Mac, Richard's investigators are maybe hours away from connecting you to the Artemis disaster. When they do, they're going to present you as an unstable man with a history of causing deaths through negligence. They'll use that to argue that I'm exposing Danny to danger by associating with you. And they'd be right, wouldn't they? Mac's voice was heavy with self-recrimination. I am dangerous. Look what happened the last time someone trusted my judgment. Victoria stood up, moving closer to him. Mac, look at me. Really look at me. Reluctantly, he met her eyes. I built a $20 billion company by making decisions based on data, not emotion, she said. I've analyzed your work, your character, your actions. If I thought for 1 second that you were dangerous to Danny, do you think I would have let him spend time with you? Do you think I would be here right now? Mac's expression wavered between hope and disbelief. You really think I wasn't responsible? I don't think it. I know it. And I can prove it. How Victoria pulled out her phone again, scrolling through screens of data. I've had my team pulling NASA files for the past 6 hours. We found purchasing records that show the agency bought substandard materials for the Artemis 3 mission to save costs. We found emails between supervisory personnel discussing how to minimize your involvement in the final design reviews. We found testimony from the official investigation that was later recanted by witnesses who said they were pressured to blame you rather than institutional failures. Max stared at the information flowing across her phone screen, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been the first stirrings of vindication. This is real, he whispered. This is real, Mac. You were innocent. You've been innocent all along. For a moment, Victoria thought he might break down entirely. 15 years of guilt and self-imposed exile warred with the possibility of redemption in his features. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. Sarah, David, Jennifer, their families, they blamed me. At the funerals, Sarah's mother looked at me like I was a murderer. Because they were told you were responsible, Victoria said gently. Because NASA needed someone to blame, and you were convenient. But Mac, that doesn't make you guilty. That makes you a victim too. Mac was quiet for a long time, processing not just the information, but the emotional weight of 15 years of misplaced guilt. Finally, he looked up at Victoria with something approaching his old confidence. What happens now, he asked. Now we prove your innocence publicly, we clear your name, and we make sure Richard can't use any of this against us in court. And you're willing to risk your cover story to do that? Victoria smiled, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, it was completely genuine. Mac, my cover story was blown the moment Richard's investigators found us. The only question now is whether we fight back or let him destroy both our lives. Mac was quiet for another moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, but I have one condition. Name it. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Full disclosure, complete transparency. I'm tired of hiding from the truth, even when it hurts. Victoria extended her hand. Partners. Max shook it, his grip firm and steady. Partners, but Victoria. Yes. Next time you want to tell me you're a secret billionaire, maybe lead with that information. Would have saved us both some awkward conversations. Despite everything, Victoria laughed. I'll keep that in mind for future reference. What neither of them knew was that across town, Richard Ashford was already on a private jet bound for Millbrook, armed with a preliminary report that painted Max Sullivan as exactly the kind of dangerous influence he needed to win his custody case. The real battle was about to begin. Richard Ashford stepped out of his black Mercedes SUV and surveyed the modest main street of Millbrook with the distaste of a man accustomed to more sophisticated surroundings. At 55, he carried himself with the predatory confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades acquiring companies, dismantling them for profit, and moving on to the next target without a backward glance. Today, his target was his own ex-wife and son. Behind him, 3 other vehicles disgorge a small army of lawyers, private investigators, and corporate security personnel. Richard never traveled light when conducting what he considered hostile takeovers, and he viewed this custody dispute in exactly those terms. "Sir," approached Sandra Kelly, his lead attorney and the architect of his legal strategy, "the preliminary injunction papers are ready. As soon as we serve Victoria with the emergency custody motion, she'll be legally required to surrender Daniel to your custody pending the full hearing." "And our evidence?" Richard asked, his eyes already calculating the angles of attack. "Strong. The Blackstone investigation has provided us with everything we need. Victoria's been living under a false identity, exposing Daniel to an unstable individual with a documented history of causing deaths through professional negligence. Any family court judge will see the clear and present danger to the child." Richard smiled, though there was no warmth in the expression. "Excellent. And the mechanic, Marcus Sullivan, former NASA engineer responsible for the Artemis III disaster that killed 3 astronauts. He's been living under an assumed identity for 15 years, clearly indicating ongoing psychological instability. The fact that Victoria has been allowing Daniel to spend unsupervised time with such an individual demonstrates catastrophically poor judgment on her part." "Perfect." Richard checked his Rolex. "Let's pay my dear ex-wife a visit." 3 miles away, Victoria was explaining the situation to Danny while Mac worked nearby, his movements betraying the nervous energy of a man preparing for a fight he'd been avoiding for 15 years. "Danny, do you remember when I told you that sometimes people have to pretend to be someone else to stay safe?" Victoria asked, crouched down to her son's eye level. Danny nodded solemnly. At 8, he was already more perceptive than many adults gave him credit for. "Like superheroes." "Something like that. Well, I haven't been completely honest about who we really are." "Are you a superhero, Mom?" Victoria smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "Not exactly, sweetheart. But I do have a very important job, and we have a lot more money than I've been pretending we do." Danny's eyes widened. "Are we rich?" "Very rich. And your father found out where we've been hiding, so he's coming here to try to take you away from me." Danny's expression immediately shifted to alarm. "I don't want to go with him. Mom, I want to stay with you and Mr. Mac." Mac looked up from his workbench, his face softening at the boy's words. Over the past months, Danny had become like a son to him, the family he'd never thought he'd have again. "We're going to fight to make sure you can stay," Victoria assured Danny. "But it might get complicated, and some people might say things about Mr. Mac that aren't true." "What kind of things?" Victoria glanced at Mac, who nodded grimly. They'd agreed on complete honesty, no matter how difficult. "They're going to say that Mr. Mac hurt some people a long time ago, that he made mistakes that caused people to die." Danny's face scrunched up in confusion. "But that's not true. Mr. Mac saves people. He saved me." "You're absolutely right," Victoria said firmly. "Mr. Mac didn't hurt anyone, but sometimes people believe lies because the truth is more complicated." The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the garage's front windows, they could see the convoy of black SUVs pulling up outside, their tinted windows and aggressive styling radiating menace even in broad daylight. "He's here," Victoria said quietly, standing up and unconsciously moving to position herself between Danny and the approaching threat. Richard Ashford entered Sullivan's auto repair like a conquering general, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the garage's working-class environment. His lawyers flanked him, briefcases in hand and expressions of practiced intimidation firmly in place. "Victoria," Richard said, his tone carrying false warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "You're looking well. Small-town life seems to agree with you." "Richard," Victoria's voice was ice cold. "What do you want?" "I want my son," Richard replied simply. "Daniel, come here. We're going home." Danny shrank back against Mac's legs, his small hands gripping the mechanic's work pants. "I don't want to go with you." Richard's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice. Daniel, your mother has been making very poor decisions about your safety and well-being." Sandra Kelly stepped forward, producing a sheaf of legal documents. "Victoria Ashford, you're being served with an emergency motion for temporary custody of Daniel Ashford. The court has found sufficient evidence of endangerment to warrant immediate intervention." Victoria snatched the papers, her eyes scanning the legal language with practiced speed. "This is ridiculous. Danny is perfectly safe with me." "Safe?" Richard's voice rose theatrically. "You've been living under a false identity, associating with a man responsible for the deaths of 3 people, exposing our son to God knows what kind of psychological instability. Do you call that safe?" Max stepped forward, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "I've never harmed Danny. I've never harmed anyone." "Tell that to Commander Sarah Chen's family," Richard shot back. "Tell that to the families of the other astronauts who died because of your incompetence." "That's enough," Victoria snapped. "Mac wasn't responsible for those deaths, and you know it." Richard smiled coldly. "The official NASA investigation disagrees. Dr. Marcus Sullivan, former aerospace engineer, was found directly responsible for design flaws that resulted in catastrophic system failure and the deaths of 3 astronauts. These are documented facts. Victoria, these are documented lies," Max said quietly, but his voice carried a new strength. "And I can prove it." Richard's eyebrows rose mockingly. "Oh, after 15 years of hiding like a coward, you're suddenly ready to clear your name. How convenient." Mac looked at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. They discussed this moment, prepared for it, but actually facing Richard's accusations still took every ounce of courage Mac possessed. "The Artemis III disaster wasn't caused by my design flaws," Mac said steadily. "It was caused by NASA's decision to use substandard materials to meet budget targets, despite my written objections. It was caused by supervisory personnel who overruled my safety recommendations and then scapegoated me when their cost-cutting measures resulted in tragedy." Richard laughed, the sound harsh and disbelieving. "And you have proof of these wild accusations?" Victoria stepped forward, pulling out her phone. "As a matter of fact, we do." For the first time since entering the garage, Richard looked uncertain. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that comes from having $20 billion and the best investigative team in the world," Victoria replied calmly. "Would you like to see the purchasing records showing NASA bought materials that didn't meet spec for the Artemis III mission? The email chains discussing how to minimize Mac's involvement in final safety reviews? The recanted testimony from the official investigation?" Richard's face went pale. $20 billion. What are you talking about? "I'm talking about Ashtec Corporation. Richard, the company I built while you were busy acquiring and dismantling other people's life's work. The company that made me one of the wealthiest women in the world while you were playing your small-time corporate raider games." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd known Victoria was intelligent, driven, but he'd never suspected the true scope of her success. His entire strategy had been built on portraying her as an unstable woman, making poor decisions from limited resources. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You're an administrative assistant. You're broke. The background checks showed you exactly what I wanted them to show," Victoria finished. "Just like Mac's background showed you exactly what NASA wanted people to believe 15 years ago." Sandra Kelly was frantically whispering in Richard's ear, but he waved her off. his strategic mind already adapting to the new information. Even if you're telling the truth about your wealth, he said, it doesn't change the fact that you've been living under false pretenses, exposing Daniel to potentially dangerous individuals. No court will ignore. Actually, interrupted a new voice from the garage entrance. I think they will. Everyone turned to see a distinguished woman in her 60s entering the garage, followed by what appeared to be a federal marshal. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, the woman announced, producing identification. Federal District Court, Mr. Ashford, your emergency custody motion has been denied, and you're about to find yourself facing some very serious federal charges. Richard's face went from pale to ashen. Federal charges? What are you talking about? Interstate kidnapping conspiracy, Judge Hawthorne replied calmly. Fraudulent court documents, conspiracy to obstruct justice in the matter of the Artemis III investigation. The FBI has been building a case against you for months. Mr. Ashford? Victoria stared in shock. I don't understand. How did you... Dr. Sullivan, Judge Hawthorne said, turning to Mac. 3 hours ago, NASA officially exonerated you of all responsibility in the Artemis III disaster. The agency has issued a public apology, and criminal charges are being filed against the supervisory personnel who covered up their own negligence. Your reputation has been fully restored. Max swayed slightly, as if the weight of 15 years had suddenly lifted from his shoulders. How is that possible? Because someone with significant resources and a commitment to justice spent the night ensuring that the truth finally came to light? Judge Hawthorne replied, glancing meaningfully at Victoria. The evidence was overwhelming once proper investigators were allowed to examine it. Richard was backing toward the garage entrance, his legal team in full retreat around him. This is impossible. You can't have accomplished all this overnight. Never underestimate what's possible when you have $20 billion, a mother's love, and a commitment to justice, Victoria said quietly. Richard, you're finished, not just with the custody case, but with everything. I know about the money laundering, the tax evasion, the bribes to foreign officials. Did you really think I spent 15 years married to you without learning exactly who you really were? Federal marshals were moving in now, surrounding Richard and his retreating legal team. As handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, he looked back at Victoria with something approaching admiration mixed with hatred. You planned this, he said. All of it. The small town, the hidden identity, even meeting Sullivan. This was all an elaborate trap. Victoria shook her head. I came here to protect my son, Richard. Everything else was just serendipity. The universe has a way of providing exactly what you need when you need it most. As Richard was led away, Danny emerged from behind Mac's legs, his young face bright with excitement. Mom, does this mean we can stay with Mr. Mac? Victoria looked at Mac, seeing in his eyes the same hope and possibility that she felt in her own heart. If Mr. Mac wants us to stay, Mac crouched down to Danny's level, his voice gentle but firm. Danny, I'd like nothing more than for you and your mom to stay. If she'll have me, I was hoping we could be a real family. Danny threw his arms around Mac's neck. Yes, can we live in the garage? Mac laughed, the sound rich and full of joy for the first time in 15 years. I think we can do better than the garage, buddy. Your mom's got some pretty fancy houses we could choose from. Victoria smiled, feeling truly happy for the first time since, well, perhaps for the first time ever. Actually, I was thinking we could stay right here in Millbrook. I like it here. It feels like home. As federal agents finished processing the scene, and Judge Hawthorne departed with assurances that all charges against Mac would be formally dropped within the week, the three of them stood together in the quiet garage that had become the center of their new world. So what happens now? Mac asked. Victoria took his hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of honest work, and smiled. Now we figure out what happily ever after looks like for a billionaire CEO, a vindicated engineer, and one very smart 8-year-old boy. I vote for lots of cars, and Danny chimed in. And maybe some rockets. Mr. Mac used to build rockets. Mac grinned. I think that can be arranged. The sign outside Sullivan's Auto Repair had been replaced with something considerably more impressive. Sullivan Ashford Advanced Transportation Research Center. The modest garage had expanded into a state-of-the-art facility that combined Mac's engineering expertise with Victoria's technological resources and business acumen. Inside, the sounds of innovation filled the air, not just the familiar whir of automotive repair, but the hum of 3D printers, the soft beeping of computer diagnostics, and the occasional whoop of excitement from young engineers testing new propulsion concepts. Max stood in the main laboratory, wearing jeans and a lab coat that bore the NASA logo he'd thought he'd never see again. In his hands was a tablet displaying telemetry data from the test firing of a new engine design, one that incorporated lessons learned from the Artemis tragedy but built upon the sound foundations of his original work. The fuel efficiency numbers are incredible, said Dr. Lisa Park, one of the young engineers Victoria had recruited from MIT. If these tests scale up to full-size applications, we could be looking at a revolution in space exploration. Mac nodded, but his attention was divided. Through the laboratory windows, he could see Danny working alongside two other children, the sons and daughters of employees who had grown up around the facility. They were building model rockets under the guidance of Sarah Chen's brother, David, who had become one of Mac's closest collaborators after learning the truth about the Artemis disaster. Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Park prompted. Sorry, Max said, refocusing on the data. The numbers look good. Let's schedule a full-scale test for next week. The laboratory door opened to admit Victoria, who had traded her corporate power suits for jeans and sweaters, but had lost none of her commanding presence. At 48, she looked younger and happier than she had during her years running Ashtec from a Manhattan penthouse. How are our young rocket scientists doing? She asked, joining Mac at the window. They're designing a mission to Mars, Mac replied, slipping his arm around her waist. Danny's convinced he can solve the radiation shielding problem using electromagnetic fields and really strong magnets. Victoria laughed. He might not be wrong. Some of his ideas are remarkably sophisticated. He gets that from his mother, Max said, pressing a kiss to her temple. And his work ethic from his stepfather, Victoria replied, leaning into his embrace. The word stepfather still gave Mac a small thrill. Their wedding 6 months earlier had been a simple affair, just family and close friends gathered in the workshop where they'd first found each other. Danny had served as both ring-bearer and best man, proudly declaring during the ceremony that he now had the coolest parents in the universe. Speaking of family, Victoria said, I got a call from the Nobel Committee this morning. Mac raised an eyebrow. Oh, they're considering you for next year's physics prize. Something about your contributions to propulsion technology and your role in advancing safety protocols in aerospace engineering. Mac was quiet for a moment, processing the information. 15 years ago, he would have considered a Nobel Prize the pinnacle of professional achievement. Now, watching Danny explain rocket science to his friends while Victoria planned their evening together, he realized he'd already won something far more valuable. That's nice, he said finally. But I've got everything I need right here. Victoria smiled, understanding perfectly. Success, she'd learned, wasn't measured in awards or wealth or public recognition. It was measured in moments like this, standing in a workshop built on love and second chances, watching their son dream of touching the stars while knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Outside, the Ohio sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the small town in shades of gold and amber. And in the Sullivan Ashford Advanced Transportation Research Center, 3 people who had found each other against all odds continued to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate pasts. Danny's voice carried through the window, excited and certain. I know exactly how we're going to get to Mars, and it's going to be amazing. Mac and Victoria exchanged a look that said everything about love, hope, and the infinite possibilities that opened up when you had the courage to trust in tomorrow. Yeah, buddy, Mac called back to his son. I think it is. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't measured in courtrooms or bank accounts, but in the quiet moments when a child laughs without fear, when a man stops running from shadows that were never his to carry, and when a woman realizes that the strongest fortress isn't built from walls, but from the courage to let someone in. Max Sullivan lost 15 years to a lie that wasn't his fault. Victoria Ashford nearly lost her son to a man who confused control with love. Danny almost lost the chance to know what real family feels like. But in a small garage in Ohio, surrounded by grease-stained tools and impossible dreams, they found something worth more than vindication, more valuable than billions. They found each other. The scars remain. The NASA investigation, the custody battle, the years of isolation, these things leave marks that never fully fade. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps our broken places are where the light gets in, where love takes root, where second chances bloom into something beautiful. In the end, redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about having the courage to build a future worthy of the people who believe in you. What would you risk everything for? What truth would you fight to protect, even if the whole world told you to stay silent?